March 7, 1945, Remagen, Germany. A platoon of American soldiers crests a hill above the Rhine River and stares down in disbelief at something no Allied commander expected to see anywhere along this 400-mile stretch of water. A bridge, fully intact, still standing. The Ludendorff Bridge, a massive iron railway span crossing one of the widest and most heavily defended rivers in Europe, should have been rubble weeks ago. Named after German General Erich Ludendorff, a hero of the First World War, the bridge had been constructed decades earlier, specifically to move German troops and supplies rapidly between the Rhineland and the Western Front, an irony not lost on the American soldiers, who now find themselves poised to use it for precisely the opposite purpose, carrying an invading army in the reverse direction, deep into the heart of the nation that built it. Every other crossing along the Rhine has already been destroyed by retreating German forces, demolished specifically to deny Allied armies the one thing they need most, to carry the war onto German soil, without the catastrophic cost of an opposed river assault. Yet here, at a small town called Remagen, German engineers have failed to blow their own bridge in time, and a lieutenant named Karl Timmermann is about to lead his men directly into the crosshairs of German demolition charges, still wired and armed beneath the bridge's iron trusses. Timmermann, 22 years old and born in Germany himself before his family emigrated to the United States, finds himself in the strange position of leading an American assault into the very country of his own birth, a detail that adds a layer of personal resonance to an already extraordinary moment that his own men, focused entirely on the immediate danger in front of them, have little time to reflect upon in the chaos of the advance. What General Omar Bradley does in the hours after learning this news will upend months of Allied planning, defy the strategic priorities of his own supreme commander, and hand the United States Army a gift that Adolf Hitler's own generals will pay for with their lives. Bradley, a career soldier known throughout the war for his careful, methodical approach to command rather than any inclination toward reckless improvisation, now finds himself weighing a decision that will test exactly those instincts. Forced to choose within hours whether to gamble on an unexpected opportunity or defer cautiously to a strategic framework designed weeks earlier under entirely different assumptions about where and how the Rhine would ultimately be crossed. To understand why a single intact bridge carries such staggering weight, you have to understand what the Rhine River represents to both sides in March 1945. For the German army, the Rhine is the last great natural barrier protecting the industrial heartland of Germany itself, a psychological and physical line that, if breached, opens the road directly into the country's interior, with no comparable obstacle remaining between Allied forces and Berlin. German propaganda throughout the war's final winter has repeatedly invoked the Rhine as an almost sacred boundary, a line the Wehrmacht would defend to the last man, and the psychological weight of that rhetoric makes the river's loss, when it finally comes, all the more devastating to German morale on both the front lines and the home front. Hitler has ordered every bridge across the river wired for demolition, understanding that denying the Allies a crossing point could buy Germany precious weeks, perhaps months, to organize whatever defense remains possible from an army already broken by nearly a year of continuous retreat since the Normandy invasion. German engineering units have spent the preceding weeks methodically preparing charges beneath every remaining span, working under constant threat of Allied air attack and artillery fire, racing against the advancing American and British armies to ensure that no crossing point survives long enough to be exploited, a task complicated by dwindling supplies of explosives, damaged detonation equipment, and the sheer chaos gripping German logistics in the war's final desperate months. German High Command has issued explicit, repeated orders emphasizing that any bridge falling intact into Allied hands would be treated as a grave failure of duty, a directive that places enormous pressure on the relatively junior officers assigned responsibility for each individual crossing, men often working with inadequate resources and unclear lines of communication as the front collapses around them faster than headquarters can issue coherent instructions. For the Allies, the Rhine represents the final major obstacle standing between the armies that have fought since June 1944 and the collapse of Nazi Germany itself, and Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower has built his entire strategy for the war's final phase around a carefully planned, methodically resourced crossing, one designed to take place not at Remagen, but far to the north, where Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group is assembling the men, boats, and equipment for what Eisenhower intends to be the primary, war-ending thrust into Germany. Montgomery's planned crossing, designated Operation Plunder, and scheduled for later in March 1945, involves months of meticulous preparation, thousands of specialized landing craft transported overland from Britain, massive artillery concentrations, and an airborne component intended to seize ground on the river's eastern bank ahead of the main assault. A methodical, overwhelming set-piece operation, designed specifically to avoid the kind of costly, improvised river crossing that a hasty attempt elsewhere along the Rhine might otherwise require. Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group and overseeing the American 1st and 9th Armies advancing toward the Rhine from the west, has spent weeks watching German forces retreat eastward across the river, blowing bridge after bridge behind them with methodical, almost ruthless efficiency. Bradley's own forces have, by early March 1945, already fought their way through the remnants of the Siegfried Line and the brutal defensive fighting of the Rhineland campaign, an advance that has cost thousands of American casualties, even as German resistance grows increasingly disorganized and desperate with each passing week. And Bradley approaches the Rhine itself, expecting nothing more than the same pattern of destroyed crossings that has defined every previous river obstacle encountered since the breakout from Normandy. Weeks of fighting through flooded fields, fortified villages, and the dense concrete bunkers of the Siegfried Line itself have left Bradley's divisions exhausted but battle-hardened, veteran units accustomed to grinding, methodical advances measured in a few miles per week, rather than the kind of dramatic breakthrough that Remagen is about to hand them. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commanding the 1st Army pushing toward Remagen itself, has received no indication that this particular crossing point offers anything different from the dozens of destroyed spans already encountered along hundreds of miles of riverbank. Hodges, a quiet, unassuming commander often overshadowed in popular memory by more flamboyant generals like Patton, has nonetheless overseen some of the 1st Army's most consequential fighting of the entire war, from the Hürtgen Forest to the northern shoulder of the Battle of the Bulge, and his forces approaching Remagen in early March carry with them the accumulated exhaustion and hard-won caution of an army that has learned, through repeated bitter experience, not to expect good fortune at any German-held river crossing. The soldiers of Combat Command B, 9th Armored Division, under the command of Brigadier General William Hoge, approach Remagen on the morning of March 7th, expecting nothing more than another demolished bridge and another delay in an advance that has, by this stage of the war, grown accustomed to disappointment at every river crossing attempted. Hoge's men, part of a division that has fought continuously since landing in Normandy the previous summer, move toward the town with the practiced, weary caution of veteran soldiers, scouts probing forward carefully to assess German defenses before committing the bulk of the command to any serious engagement, an approach shaped by months of costly lessons about the dangers of advancing carelessly into terrain still held, even loosely, by determined German rearguards. Scouts crest the ridgeline above the town in the early afternoon, and what they radio back to Hoge's command post arrives almost as a stunned, disbelieving murmur rather than a crisp tactical report. Officers on the receiving end, initially assuming some error in transmission, before the same message repeats. Unmistakably, the bridge at Remagen still stands. What Hoge's men discover instead will force Bradley into one of the most consequential decisions of his entire command, a decision that pits immediate tactical opportunity against Eisenhower's carefully calibrated strategic plan, and that must be made not over days of deliberation, but within hours, before German engineers can finish what their demolition charges have, for reasons no one yet understands, failed to accomplish. News of the discovery travels up the chain of command with unusual speed, officers at every level immediately grasping that whatever has happened at Remagen represents something categorically different from the routine reports of destroyed crossings that have crossed their desks for weeks, an anomaly demanding immediate attention rather than the standard bureaucratic processing afforded to more ordinary battlefield developments. Does Bradley seize this unexpected gift and risk upending months of Allied planning built around Montgomery's northern crossing? Or does he play it safe, watch the bridge inevitably fall to German demolition anyway, and stick to the plan Eisenhower has already approved. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, commanding Company A of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, receives the order to advance toward the bridge shortly after his unit crests the hill overlooking Remagen on the afternoon of March 7, 1945. What he and his men see below defies every expectation built from weeks of encountering nothing but destroyed river crossings. The Ludendorff Bridge stands intact, its twin stone towers rising from either bank, German soldiers visible moving across its length, and, most alarmingly to the Americans watching from above, clear evidence that demolition charges have already been placed and wired beneath its iron superstructure. The bridge itself, stretching across a river more than 1,000 feet wide at this point, presents an almost surreal sight to the American soldiers peering down from the surrounding hillside. A fully functional, apparently undamaged crossing, standing in stark contrast to the twisted, collapsed wreckage they have grown accustomed to finding at every other river obstacle along their advance, a scene that seems almost too fortunate to be real, even as scouts continue reporting back confirmation of exactly what their eyes are telling them. Brigadier General William Hoge, receiving reports of the intact bridge at his own command post, faces an immediate and consequential choice of his own. Order a rapid assault to seize the crossing before German engineers can detonate their charges, or hold back and risk watching the opportunity vanish in a single explosion, exactly as it has vanished at every other crossing point along the entire length of the river. Hoge orders the assault. Timmerman's infantry, supported by tanks of the 14th Tank Battalion, providing covering fire against German positions on the far bank, begin advancing directly onto the bridge itself at approximately 3:50 in the afternoon, fully aware that German engineers could trigger the demolition charges at any moment, potentially destroying the bridge with American soldiers standing on it. Timmerman himself leads from the front, walking his men out onto the bridge's exposed span under scattered German small arms fire from positions on the far bank. Every step forward, a calculated gamble against the very real possibility that the entire structure could erupt beneath them without warning, an act of personal courage that his own soldiers later credit as decisive in maintaining the platoon's forward momentum through the most dangerous minutes of the entire crossing. As Timmerman's men move forward, German defenders detonate a preliminary charge intended to create a defensive crater at the bridge's near approach, an explosion that showers the advancing Americans with debris, but fails to stop their momentum. The psychological shock of the blast, nearly as dangerous as its physical effect on men who now understand, beyond any doubt, that the main demolition charges could still detonate beneath their feet at any second. Soldiers described the sound of the initial blast as deafening, even from a distance, the concussion rattling their teeth and momentarily disorienting the leading elements of the assault. Several men instinctively diving for whatever cover the bridge's iron trusswork could offer, before realizing, seconds later, that the structure itself remained standing and the advance could continue. Then, as Timmerman's soldiers continue their advance across the span itself, German engineers attempt to trigger the primary demolition charges, the explosion that should have collapsed the entire bridge into the Rhine, taking dozens of advancing American soldiers with it, simply fails to occur, the reasons still debated by historians decades later. Faulty wiring, damaged detonation cable cut by earlier artillery fire, or a demolition charge improperly prepared amid the chaos and confusion gripping German forces in the war's final desperate weeks. German Captain Karl Friesenhahn, the officer responsible for the bridge's demolition, later describes in post-war interrogation the mounting panic of those critical seconds, desperately working the detonator switch, again and again, as American soldiers continued advancing across the span, unable to understand in the moment why the charges he had personally overseen the placement of were failing to respond. A second, more determined attempt to manually detonate a portion of the charges finally produces a partial explosion, damaging sections of the bridge's decking and briefly halting the American advance in a chaotic scene of smoke, falling debris, and soldiers scrambling for cover on a structure that seems, for several terrifying seconds, about to collapse entirely beneath them. The blast tears a visible gap in portions of the bridge's wooden decking and sends a shudder through the entire iron framework, some soldiers later describing the sensation as feeling the whole structure lurch beneath their boots, a moment of pure terror in which every man on the bridge fully expects the entire span to give way, and plunge them into the icy waters of the Rhine below. Yet when the smoke clears, the Ludendorff Bridge remains standing, battered but structurally intact, still spanning the Rhine. Sergeant Alexander Drabik, part of Timmerman's advancing company, becomes the first American soldier to cross the entire span and set foot on the eastern bank of the Rhine, a moment that will be remembered as one of the singular achievements of the entire European campaign, the first Allied soldier to cross Germany's last great natural barrier by an intact bridge, rather than by boat, pontoon, or aircraft. Drabik, a 27-year-old from Ohio, serving as a squad leader in Timmerman's company, later describes the final sprint across the bridge's last stretch as the longest run of his entire life, expecting with every stride that the structure might still detonate beneath him even after surviving the earlier partial explosion, driven forward by sheer momentum and the knowledge that stopping now, so close to the far bank, made no more sense than continuing. Within minutes, more of Timmerman's company follows across, securing the bridge's eastern approach and the small German bunkers and gun positions defending it, engineers moving in behind the infantry to begin frantically cutting demolition wires and removing any remaining explosive charges before German forces can mount a second attempt at destruction. American combat engineers, working with the same urgency that had driven the infantry across the bridge only minutes earlier, methodically trace every visible wire back to its source, disconnecting detonators and removing satchel charges still strapped to the bridge's iron supports, aware that a single overlooked charge could still be triggered remotely or by a German soldier willing to sacrifice himself to finish the demolition his comrades had failed to complete. Word of the capture reaches Bradley's headquarters within hours, and the news arrives amid genuine institutional skepticism from officers who initially struggle to believe the report is accurate. Bradley's own chief of staff reportedly questions whether the report might be exaggerated or mistaken, the capture of an intact Rhine bridge seeming, after months of encountering nothing but demolished crossings, almost too fortunate to be true. Bradley himself later recalls demanding independent confirmation before allowing himself to fully believe what his subordinates were telling him, aware that acting on faulty information at this critical juncture could prove enormously costly if the report turned out to be exaggerated or premature. Bradley, once satisfied the report is genuine, immediately recognizes the magnitude of what has fallen into his lap, but also understands that seizing the opportunity fully means directly contradicting the broader strategic framework Eisenhower has built the entire final campaign around, a framework that assigns the primary Rhine crossing not to Bradley's forces at Remagen, but to Montgomery's carefully prepared operation, scheduled for later in March, far to the north. Bradley weighs this tension carefully, even as the clock continues running against him, aware that every hour spent deliberating is an hour German forces might use to organize a more effective counterattack against the tenuous American foothold, or to find some alternate means of finishing the demolition their initial charges had failed to accomplish. Bradley telephones Eisenhower's headquarters immediately, requesting authorization to rush reinforcements across the captured bridge and establish a substantial bridgehead on the Rhine's eastern bank before German forces can organize a counterattack or find some alternate way to destroy the span. The conversation, according to accounts from officers present at both ends of the call, carries a tension that reflects the genuine strategic stakes involved. Bradley pressing urgently for immediate authorization to exploit an opportunity he understands may not remain available for long, while officers at Supreme Headquarters weigh the request against a strategic framework built around an entirely different set of assumptions about how and where the decisive Rhine crossing would ultimately occur. The response from Eisenhower's staff proves, in the moment, maddeningly cautious. Officers at Supreme Headquarters, wary of diverting resources and attention away from Montgomery's carefully planned northern crossing, initially hesitate to fully commit to exploiting Bradley's unexpected opportunity, concerned that scattering Allied strength across multiple crossing points could weaken the decisive, concentrated northern thrust Eisenhower has spent months preparing. Some staff officers reportedly argue, in the heated exchanges of that afternoon, that reinforcing an unplanned crossing risks creating a vulnerable, isolated salient that German forces could potentially cut off and destroy, a legitimate operational concern that nonetheless threatens, if allowed to prevail, to squander an opportunity that Bradley and his field commanders increasingly recognize may never present itself again in quite the same form. For several tense hours, the fate of the Remagen bridgehead hangs in a genuine state of uncertainty, Bradley pressing his case forcefully, while Eisenhower's staff weighs the risk of disrupting a strategic plan built around an entirely different crossing point hundreds of miles away. Eisenhower himself, once briefed directly on the situation, makes the decision that resolves the crisis. Rather than treating Remagen as a distraction from the primary northern crossing, he authorizes Bradley to exploit the bridgehead fully, ordering additional divisions rushed to the crossing point to reinforce Hodges's forces before German counterattacks can threaten the tenuous American foothold on the river's eastern bank. Eisenhower reportedly receives the news of the bridge's capture while meeting with other senior staff, and by several accounts, his reaction shifts within moments from initial disbelief to genuine excitement, recognizing almost immediately the scale of the opportunity that circumstance has handed the Allied war effort. Even as he understands the decision he is about to make will complicate the carefully sequenced strategic plan built around Montgomery's operation further north. It is a decision made swiftly, once made, but one that comes only after hours of institutional hesitation that could easily have cost the Allies the very opportunity Timmerman's men had risked their lives to create. Eisenhower later explains his reasoning in blunt, practical terms. A bridge already captured, at minimal cost, represents an opportunity too valuable to abandon for the sake of preserving a strategic plan, conceived before anyone knew such an opportunity might exist. German commanders, meanwhile, recognize immediately the catastrophic nature of the failure at Remagen, and Hitler's response reflects the full fury of a dictator confronting yet another collapse in a war already slipping irretrievably from Germany's grasp. Reports of the bridge's capture reach Hitler's headquarters within hours, and by every account from those present, his reaction combines disbelief with a rage that quickly hardens into a demand for immediate accountability. The dictator, unable or unwilling to accept that simple mechanical and human failure, rather than deliberate treachery, might explain how such a critical crossing point had fallen intact into American hands. Convinced that incompetence or even deliberate sabotage must explain how an intact bridge fell into American hands, Hitler orders a court-martial of the German officers responsible for the bridge's defense and demolition, a tribunal that results in several officers being sentenced to death and executed within days, a grim illustration of the increasingly desperate and vengeful atmosphere gripping the German high command as the war's final weeks unfold. Major Hans Scheller, one of the officers held responsible for the bridge's failed demolition, despite having only recently been assigned command of the sector and having had little direct control over the technical execution of the demolition itself, is among those executed, a fate that underscores the arbitrary, panic-driven nature of the German military justice being dispensed in these final catastrophic weeks of the regime's collapse. Simultaneously, German forces launch repeated efforts to destroy the bridge by other means, artillery bombardment targeting the span throughout the following days, along with attempts to employ V-2 rockets against the crossing, the only recorded instance in the entire war of Germany's vaunted vengeance weapon being used against a tactical, rather than strategic target, and even German frogmen dispatched in a failed effort to plant demolition charges against the bridge's underwater support structures. German artillery, firing from positions still holding out east of the bridgehead, subjects the crossing and the growing American positions around it to near-constant bombardment throughout the following week, shells falling among the engineers working to reinforce the damaged structure and the columns of vehicles and soldiers streaming across it. A dangerous, unglamorous ordeal that never receives the same attention as the dramatic capture itself, but that soldiers who lived through it remember as some of the most harrowing days of the entire campaign. None of these efforts succeed in destroying the bridge before American engineers can reinforce it and construct additional pontoon crossings alongside the original span, but the structure itself, already damaged by the partial demolition on March 7th and subjected to 10 days of continuous heavy military traffic it was never designed to bear, finally gives way on its own. American engineers, working around the clock in an effort to shore up the bridge's damaged sections, install steel bracing and temporary supports throughout the 10 days following its capture, a race against structural fatigue that ultimately proves unwinnable given the sheer volume of tanks, trucks, and heavy equipment. The span is forced to bear far beyond anything its original designers had ever anticipated. On March 17, 1945, 10 days after its unexpected capture, the Ludendorff Bridge collapses into the Rhine without German assistance. The cumulative structural damage from the original demolition attempt, subsequent artillery strikes, and the sheer weight of tanks, trucks, and soldiers crossing continuously for over a week, finally proving too much for the battered iron structure to bear. Witnesses describe the collapse as sudden and almost silent by comparison to the violent demolition attempts that had failed to bring the bridge down days earlier. A low groaning of tortured metal, followed by the entire central span simply folding downward into the river, carrying with it the engineers who had spent the preceding days working desperately on its damaged trusses and decking. The collapse kills 28 American engineers who had been working on the bridge at the time, reinforcing its damaged sections in a desperate effort to keep it operational, and wounds many more, a tragic coda to an episode that had otherwise unfolded as one of the most fortunate strokes of the entire European campaign. Rescue efforts along the riverbank begin almost immediately, soldiers and medics working through the cold March waters to pull survivors from the wreckage, even as portions of the collapsed structure continue settling and shifting in the current. A chaotic and dangerous salvage operation, conducted under the constant threat that unstable sections of the bridge might still give way further, adding to the casualty toll among the rescuers themselves. Men wade into the frigid river fully clothed, ignoring the risk of hypothermia in the urgent effort to reach comrades trapped beneath twisted iron and floating debris, an act of desperate camaraderie that soldiers who witnessed it describe, even decades later, as one of the most harrowing scenes of the entire campaign, unfolding not amid the chaos of enemy fire, but in the strange, cruel aftermath of a structure simply failing under its own accumulated weight. By the time the bridge finally falls, however, American engineers have already completed several pontoon bridges spanning the Rhine alongside it, ensuring that the loss of the original crossing does nothing to slow the flow of troops and equipment now pouring across the river into the heart of Germany. These pontoon structures, assembled from prefabricated sections ferried forward through the same logistical pipeline that had supported every major river crossing of the entire campaign, represent their own remarkable feat of combat engineering, built and maintained under intermittent German artillery fire by soldiers who understood that their work, unglamorous as it seemed compared to the dramatic capture of the original bridge, had become just as essential to sustaining the entire American advance into Germany. The strategic consequences of the Remagen bridgehead extend far beyond the 10 days the original bridge remained standing. Within a week of its capture, more than 8,000 American troops have crossed into the bridgehead on the river's eastern bank, a foothold that rapidly expands as reinforcements pour across the original bridge and the pontoon spans built alongside it, eventually growing into a bridgehead extending several miles in depth and width, secured against repeated German counterattacks that never come close to eliminating the American position. German commanders, scraping together whatever reserves remain available in the sector, launch a series of increasingly desperate counterattacks throughout mid-March, aimed at containing or eliminating the expanding bridgehead, attacks that grow progressively weaker as German units, already battered by months of continuous retreat, prove unable to concentrate the kind of coordinated armored force that might once have posed a genuine threat to the American position. This unplanned crossing, seized through tactical opportunism rather than the methodical, carefully resourced operation Eisenhower had originally envisioned, ultimately allows American forces to begin their advance into the German industrial heartland, weeks ahead of the timeline Allied planners had projected before Remagen's capture. A head start that compounds with each passing day as German defenses, already strained past their breaking point, prove utterly incapable of containing multiple simultaneous Allied crossings converging on the collapsing Reich from several directions at once. When Montgomery's own carefully planned Operation Plunder finally launches later in March, it does so against a German defense already fatally weakened by the unplanned diversion of forces and attention toward containing the Remagen bridgehead, an irony not lost on historians who note that the accidental crossing at Remagen may have done as much to ease the path for Montgomery's meticulously prepared operation as any element of the original plan itself. For Bradley personally, the decision to aggressively exploit the Remagen crossing, made under enormous time pressure and initially against the instincts of Eisenhower's own cautious staff, becomes one of the most celebrated command decisions of his entire wartime career. a moment when recognizing and seizing an unexpected tactical opportunity proved more consequential than adhering rigidly to a strategic plan conceived before circumstances on the ground had changed. Bradley himself, reflecting on the episode in his post-war memoirs, describes the frustration of those initial hours spent convincing Eisenhower's staff to fully commit to exploiting the bridgehead, recalling the sense of having been handed an extraordinary gift only to nearly watch it squandered through institutional caution before Eisenhower's own direct intervention finally settled the matter decisively in Bradley's favor. Military historians studying the campaign in the decades since have consistently highlighted Remagen as a textbook illustration of the value of battlefield flexibility, the willingness of commanders at every level, from Hoger's decision to order an immediate assault, to Timmerman's soldiers advancing across a bridge they knew might explode beneath them at any second, to Bradley's insistence on exploiting the opportunity fully, despite institutional hesitation from above, to act decisively on fleeting advantage, rather than waiting for circumstances to align perfectly with pre-existing plans. Modern military academies continue to teach the episode as a case study in the tension between centralized strategic planning and decentralized battlefield initiative, examining how a rigid adherence to pre-existing plans might have squandered an opportunity that ultimately shortened the war by weeks, while also acknowledging the legitimate institutional caution that made Eisenhower's staff initially hesitant to fully commit resources away from a strategy built through months of careful preparation. Yet the story of Remagen also carries a quieter, more sobering dimension, one easily overshadowed by the drama of the crossing itself. The engineers who died when the bridge finally collapsed on March 17th, killed not by enemy action, but by the simple physical limits of a damaged structure asked to bear far more than it was ever designed to carry, represent a reminder that even the most celebrated triumphs of military improvisation extract a genuine human cost, often paid by the unglamorous soldiers whose labor makes such triumphs possible, but who rarely receive the same recognition as the infantrymen who first crossed under fire. Their names appear today on memorials far less visited than those honoring Timmerman's company or Drabick's historic first crossing, a quiet asymmetry in how history chooses to remember the different forms of sacrifice that made the Remagen crossing possible, from the soldiers who risked instant death, advancing across a bridge that might explode beneath them, to the engineers, who risked, and in 28 cases lost, their lives simply trying to keep that same bridge standing long enough to matter. The bridge itself no longer stands. Its twin stone towers on the western bank remain today as a memorial and museum, the only physical trace of the crossing that once altered the pace of an entire war's final months. But the story of what happened at Remagen endures as one of history's most vivid illustrations of how a single moment of German failure, a single lieutenant's willingness to advance across a bridge that might explode beneath him, and a single general's refusal to let institutional caution squander an unexpected gift, together, can compress months of carefully laid strategy into a matter of hours, and change the course of a war that had, until that single afternoon, seemed destined to unfold on an entirely different timetable. Visitors to the site today can still see the massive stone towers rising from the western bank of the Rhine, weathered by the decades but standing as a permanent reminder of the afternoon when a lieutenant's platoon, a general's willingness to gamble, and a demolition charge that simply refused to detonate, together reshaped the final chapter of the war in Europe.